It's good to be here. So yeah, I'm actually in South Dakota today visiting some clients and yeah, I'm seventh generation dairy farmer there in Wisconsin. We still operate our family still operates well, a couple dairy farms actually. But but yeah, what I spend a lot of my time in is talking forages and building forage systems for dairy farms. And currently work with about 850,000 cows in 27 states, and kind of working with the nutritionist and agronomy, and trying to kind of pull those two things together. And uh, that was something that I always felt like before I started Forage Innovations, the company. It felt like there was maybe a need for that in the industry, where there was some frustration, with agronomists who were really good at their job and knew what they wanted to accomplish, and also nutritionists, and yet they maybe didn't know how to do it together. And so that's kind of what I do, and especially now with larger dairies, nutrient management becomes a bigger part of that as well. And so trying to pull those things together. My average clients are larger dairies. We have a smaller family farm ourselves, but most of my clients are larger, CAFOs, and those farms, especially when you get out in this I-29 corridor and down in, that's the majority of your dairies, and that's where a lot of the growth has been. And so I thought maybe I'd talk about that a little bit, and like first, why I think high forage diets are important, and then what kind of forages do we need to make those reality, and talk to some of the nutrition side of it. I was It was interesting listening to the previous two speakers, and I think uh, I think there's some commonality or some things here as we go through this, uh, that we'll be able to refer back to. So of course the industry, and I'm going to talk dairy here, but the feedlots, other you know livestock, are certainly facing a lot of the same issues. We have environmental pressures, water shortages, or at least variability. I mean, this year there's some of you guys got in South Dakota, an area's got a foot of rain in a day. So, but certainly a lot of variability in extreme weather systems. Competition for land. When I first started working in South Dakota, and out in this area, land values have probably tripled, and it just seems in just 5 or 6 years. I can't, it's amazing what farmers are having to pay for non-irrigated land rents. Um, Cost of replacements have skyrocketed, not only to either to raise them or to purchase them now. It's very expensive. Transportation cost, and we get into some of the environmental issues with carbon credits, and some of the things like we heard with our first speaker here, or like a second, but and then of course the availability of byproducts, and what do those look like, and how do those impact the forages that we need to feed, and the value of the forages. So where I'm from in northeastern Wisconsin, phosphorus is a really big limiting factor, and it's interesting because we have the highest concentration of CAFOs in the country, and a lot of our ground is um, on shallow dirt. So we have dirt on top of limestone, uh, and that limestone has cracks in it, and so which goes down to the water table. And so what water quality and how we use manure is a very big deal. And I would say, as a whole, the I-29 corridor, you've had a lot of land here that maybe hasn't had manure for a long time, but that is rapidly changing, and it will continue to be an issue um, in the future, especially in some neighborhoods. And so, uh, and this will I'll look into this a little farther on when we talk about transportation. But I was just at a farm this morning, and we're talking about the difference in cost of moving manure to the field across the road versus the field that's 9 miles down the road. And it's we're talking hundreds of dollars an acre more. So where do you move the manure? How do you get it applied? And our forage systems, I think, really need to have that. into we need to take that into consideration. And so if you think of phosphorus as being a closed circle, so there's only three ways that phos leaves a farm, and that's through meat, it's through milk, and it's through pollution. Otherwise, it's all really in a closed circle. And we're not going to talk about pollution because ideally we don't have any of that. But if you think of the how many pounds of phosphorus a cow eats every day, and how much leaves via meat and milk in its lifetime, it's really only about 18 to 20% of the total diet. And so that means that on a normal farm, you should be producing 18 to 20% of every pound of feed that a cow eats should be coming from acres that are also getting your manure. If that's not happening, we're probably not going to stay phos neutral. And some of this ground has lots of capacity to build up some phos numbers, but eventually that's going to be an issue. Soybean crush capacity, that's exploding. If we think from 2018 to 2026, uh, almost doubling in capacity. And a lot of that is happening out here. And that is going to impact the value of soybean meal, uh, but it may not help the price of soybeans, but it could certainly impact the price of soybean meal. And how is that going to impact the forages that we feed, or how we value things like protein in a forage? We talked about water shortages, like that's an issue. Like when uh, we think of some of these, your states like Nebraska here that's sitting on top of the aquifer. Thankfully, you're not depleting it like some areas are. But when you look at this map and we think of where there are millions and millions of cattle sitting right over the top of those dark red areas, whether that's in Texas, Western Kansas, and Oklahoma. Transportation cost, and this can be both on feed that's coming in, whether that's hay from out west or different areas, or whether that's manure moving off your farm, but transportation costs have increased dramatically since 2016, and they're projecting that to continue. And that's partially a labor thing. There's just not that many people that want to drive trucks. It's can be partially an equipment cost thing, partially an energy cost thing, but it's a reality, and I think anybody who has to move manure or feed has experienced that. So, how should we feed cows in the future? And I would argue that the beauty of all of these challenges is that forages and how we feed cows can positively impact those challenges. Now, there's really two ways of or approaches, and of course there can be some nuance here, but there's when we start looking at sustainability and low cost and stuff, high byproduct diets can make a lot of sense, especially in areas um, that are close to processing. uh, but today we're going to look at primarily at high forage diets, and that's where I specialize in. That's kind of my thing. And and there's a lot of positives and the reasons for that, and we talked about some of that already. But the ability to cycle nutrients, to turn manure into an asset versus a liability. um, I think everybody would agree that uh, forages are more animal friendly, more rumen friendly, on ruminants. And while you certainly can have healthy animals on high byproduct diets, and you certainly can get performance, it's harder. It just is, because they're just not quite as rumen friendly. Um, there's more variation. There's more challenges. It's hard to maintain momentum on high byproduct diets. Uh, and the one thing that I think is we'll talk about more here, because I think it's a huge thing, is that feed efficiency goes up on high forage diets almost without fail. If they're put together right, we're going to see increased feed efficiency. we can have more control over things. So we also maybe only have less people to blame, but we certainly have more control if we can keep that circle, that cycle closer to home. If we can have huge piles of forage that's on our premises that we're feeding through instead of ever relying on every semi load of byproducts that come in to be the same and to show up on time and those kind of things. And we and like all these things, I think it has the potential for lower cost. Not always, especially on some forages get really expensive if we're farming on expensive ground. It doesn't rain, and we start seeing some of those 1-2 ton dry matters. You start spreading that out, they can actually get expensive. But our goal is to lower cost. So, what is a high forage diet? And every situation, every farm is going to have a different definition of what a high forage diet is. My clients in California are feeding extremely low forage diets because of, uh, because land is $30,000 an acre or whatever the number, and other things. So they're doing what they can. But for me, in an upper Midwest situation, I I call high forage diet 60% forage or more. And just for sake of discussion, that's the number I'm going to use today. So what I've developed is what we call the innovation diet, and I'll say that I'm not actually balancing rations on my clients' farms. They all have nutritionists that they work closely with. What I use the innovation diet metrics for is when we're doing forage planning. I Instead of just talking about how many tons or pounds of forage we need, I look at how many tons or pounds of fiber we need and how many pounds of digestible fiber we need, because that's the hardest thing to replicate and to bring in. We can bring protein into a diet if we need to. We can bring starch into the diet, but fiber, and especially digestible fiber, is something that's harder to purchase and to replicate. And so the innovation diet has is just a template that I lay over either problem shooting when nutritionists send me stuff or farmers send me stuff, or and for forage planning. And we have minimum and maximum um, amounts of fiber that we need, and we know that cows have minimum and maximum energy requirements. But cows are all the same. So you can have 100 different dairy nutritionists, and they might get to these numbers a little differently. They might all have their own little quirks and their own pet products that they like. But when it comes down to it, a cow is a cow is a cow. And so there's very little variation in cows. There's some maybe genetic variations and maybe some breed things. But for the most part, they all have these requirements. And so it's just like, well, how are we going to get there? And there's a lot of different ways to do it. So when we think of energy, there's three main energy sources in a diet. And that would be your starch, which of course, comes through shell corn primarily, but it can also come through things like wheat midds or other sources, um, even forage sorghum. Um, there's sugars, which there's always some residual sugars, but in fermented feeds, a lot of those have moved over into volatile fatty acids or VFAs. And there's digestible fiber. And those three things make up the large percentage of energy. There's also fat or oil, but that's a pretty static number, and I don't really talk about that too much. So the thing that we're going to talk about today primarily is digestible fiber, because that makes up the largest energy pool of forages. Uh, but we also uh, could talk about preserving sugars through harvest strategies, and maybe if I have some time, I'll circle around to that, or if anybody wants to remind me on the back end. This picture here is actually one of my plots at my farm. in that block is about 400 different grass legume combinations that we were experimenting with, and some different management synergistic kind of. We were looking at how different alfalfa varieties responded to being planted with different cool season varieties. So there's like I think 430 blocks there or something that we were collecting data off of. Um, so when we start talking about fiber, and this certainly can maybe be uh, confusing or boring, and a lot of it is because when you look at feed tests from different uh, labs, sometimes they look a little different, and so they use a little different terminology. Part of that, believe that's just labs trying to differentiate themselves, and it's kind of a marketing thing. Um, but for the most part, we're going to talk about four things that I think are really important. And every feed test you get, you should be finding, and you should be um, identifying. And that would be the NDF-OM. So the first one is the NDF. So that is neutral detergent fiber, and the OM stands for organic matter. And that is trying to identify how big is our fiber pool. Out of every pound of forage of this on a dry matter basis, of every pound, how much of it is fiber? And so that's an important number to identify. And then the next number under that is NDFD 30. And that is your neutral detergent fiber digestibility in 30 hours. So if you take that fiber and you put it in rumen fluid for 30 hours, what percentage of it is digested? That's another important number. UNDF 240 is how much it's undigestible fiber in 240 hours. Like if I took that fiber and I threw it in rumen fluid for 10 days, what percentage of it doesn't digest? I'll tell you, like if you had fiber in a cow for 10 days and it hasn't digested, like the cow has bigger issues. I could throw this table that I'm sitting on in rumen fluid, and some of it's going to digest in 10 days. But that is a infinite or it, an infinite number. The idea is that if it hasn't digested in 10 days, it's not going to digest in 10 years. And that gives us, that is largely replaced lignin in dairy nutrition because um, and UNDF is made up of lignin plus some fiber that is so closely cross-linked that it never gets digested. And then the last one, and this one is my favorite number, and this you probably actually have to do the math on it yourselves because it usually doesn't show up as a line item in on test sheets, is DNDF30. And all DNDF30 is an equation of multiplying the NDF by the digestibility of that NDF. And that number is important because DNDF30 has virtually the same energy that starch does. And if you want to feed a high forage diet, energy is generally your limiting factor. And so the more energy we can bring in through digestible fiber, the less starch we need to feed. When you feed less starch, a lot of good things start happening. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So this is a feed test. This one is from Dairyland. It's actually a few years old. Their format has changed a little bit. But I just wanted to point out some of those numbers that we just got done looking at. We looked at the the NDFOM, and on this sample, it's 34%. So that's a fairly low fiber, a small fiber pool. The digestibility of that fiber, though, is 66.43%. So this is a corn silage sample here, I believe. And so if you want to, and the UNDF 240 is 6.88. So it's under 7% undigestible fiber in 240 hours. It's 34% fiber, every pound of it. And of that fiber, 66% of it is digestible. And I did the equation down here. So this sample is 22.78% DNDF30. And when we start talking about forages and how valuable they are and where they can fit in, that's a it's a good number to keep in mind, and it can actually get us into trouble. We talk about cows going acidotic, feeding maybe too high of energy diets, and sometimes if these really good forages can actually catch us, and if we're feeding a lot of them, and push cows into an acidotic state. And so it's something to keep in mind um, when we're doing that. Sorry, I was just looking at a chat. So the other thing that I would like to talk about is this feed efficiency standpoint. So remember, I talked about NDFD 30 being a 30-hour time point. And that, when you look at this screen, we could say, well, we got three different forages here. We have corn silage, we have alfalfa, we have grass. At at 12 hours, the digestibility of the grass and the alfalfa are very similar, but alfalfa is actually a pretty awful feed when it comes to a digestible fiber source long term. It has some really fast fiber, which are the leaves, and there's some value in that. But we generally need more digestible fiber. That's why corn silage is so important, and that's where a lot of these other annuals uh, that Kanye was talking about really shine, and that those digestible fiber pool keeps going up. Now, the neat thing about them is that the rate of passage is slower. So if I look at this, let's move forward, advance. Why is it not advancing? Okay, so remember I said like in 30-hour, that's the time point. But do we know if it really stays in a cow 30 hours? I don't know if any of you have ever like grazed cattle, but we still do graze some at the one dairy. And every spring you put the cows out on the 6-inch tall grass, and they run around and act goofy and eat like crazy. And then they come in and we milk in a pit parlor without splash pans. And I can tell you, it doesn't stay in them 30 hours then. um, we have an analogy: look up and live, because they it gets explosive at times. And so we say, well, yeah, 60% NDFD 30, but what happens if it only stays in them 12 hours or 18 hours? That percentage of the fiber that you're feeding, that every pound of TMR you fed, a lot less of that was digested if that time point isn't that number. If you slide these three samples that I was just talking about, and you slide that from 30 hours back to 18, we went from 40% of the fiber not being digested and moving farther down in the out of the rumen to 60% of the fiber. So if you're feeding a 30% fiber diet and 60% of the fiber is not digested, that means that 18% of every pound of feed that you fed that cow is undigested fiber. It doesn't mean it's not digestible. It just, at least some of it would have been digestible if it stayed in them a little longer. Cornell University, well, it was so the Minor Institute, in conjunction, I believe, with Cornell, it did a study, and I was out there. Oh, this is 12 years ago, probably, doing some speaking at the Minor Institute. And Dr. Rick Grant was doing a presentation on this project that they did out there. And they fed cows BMR sorghum sedan on a pound for pound basis, so right along with corn silage. And they wanted to see like how it impacted rumen health, how it impacted animal performance, uh, and how low could they go with starch in a dairy diet. And this translates to really any ruminant on some level. Now, these cows were pregnant Holsteins, 200 plus days in milk. So they were kind of stale. And they took some, what I would consider like kind of poor quality sorghum Sudan. It was mature, 66% NDF. So this is a huge fiber pool. And they replaced it pound for pound with this corn silage sample. And uh, you can see the analysis here of it. And they had different inclusion rates: 34, 44 pounds, 34, 44 pounds of corn silage. And what it did with the diet was it moved these NDF levels to extremely high numbers that we would never consider to be lactating cow number, 40% plus. Even the corn silage diet is still plenty high. Um, and it dropped the starch into a free fall. It went down to, at the lowest, down to 10% starch, uh, versus the 27 and 30% with the corn silage diets, which are pretty standard numbers, maybe just a tick high. And they didn't balance anything in this diet. It wasn't balanced for mineralization. It wasn't balanced for anything. They just swapped them out. And what you would expect on a diet like this is that when you feed that much fiber, the cows aren't going to eat that much. I mean, that's been known for years that NDF limits intakes, and a cow has a finite amount of fiber that it can eat. And that's exactly what happened. The intakes on the sorghum Sudan diet crashed. They went at the high inclusion rate, it went from 51 pounds of dry matter intakes down to 38. And so their intakes dropped by 24%. But the interesting thing was the milk production, at least fat corrected milk, didn't really change. I mean, they lost maybe a pound of fat corrected milk, but it basically stayed the same. And so you look at this data and you're like, okay, you're eating 24% less feed. They're producing the same amount of milk. Like, well, then they must be losing weight, right? But over a 4-week trial, they actually gained weight. They actually gained more body weight with the BMR sorghum Sudan diet than they did the corn silage diet. And so then we come step back. Okay, they ate 24% less feed. They produced the same amount of milk. They gained body weight. Like, what didn't they produce? It was manure. The only thing they didn't produce was manure. Like everything else was going in and coming out. And that's what got me thinking. I saw this slide, and like, yeah, most farmers, we're not going to be happy with 65 pounds of milk, but there's a concept there that could we go part way there? Can we capture that? And there's a huge feed efficiency opportunity here, I think. So, so fat corrected or energy corrected milk went way up. Rumen pHs went up, so animals were healthier, they were happier, and we start talking like, okay, they went down 24%, which that's excessive, right? But could we go down 10%? If we went down 10% on dry matter intakes and could maintain that just by slowing our rate of passage and becoming more feed efficient in the stuff that we put into a cow, that's like real numbers. At 15 cents a pound for a TMR at 58-pound dry matter intakes, I mean, we're talking on a 3,000 cows, we're talking like $8.5–9 million a year, uh, or total feed costs. And we're saving like about $1 million a year on feed. And at $17 milk, which hopefully we get more than that at some point, but at $17 milk, that's 5.3 pounds we would have to give up before it actually cost us anything. And so, I've been working with my clients to try to increase our fiber pool and our digestible fiber pool to accomplish this. So how do we get there? Well, if we think about efficiency, we want every pound of feed that's going into a cow to do something for us. And that's going to mean that we're going to try to eliminate one-trick ponies. I'm going to, certainly straw is one that's easy to eliminate. There's a place for straw as a Band-Aid. And I've had farms that have had great responses to feeding a pound or two of straw in a diet that needed some effective fiber. Uh, but we can accomplish that with a digestible fiber source as well that actually brings value versus just being a filler. Generally, my farms are decreasing or eliminating alfalfa in the diets, and it's a great protein source, but that's about it. Like, and maybe a fast fiber source, a little like there's I think there's still a benefit for 2-3 pounds of dry matter of alfalfa, but from a digestible fiber feed efficiency standpoint, it just doesn't fit in my model very well. We're limiting byproducts. That doesn't mean we're eliminating them. And there's certainly farms and things, situations when you can buy soy hulls for $100 a ton. It's pretty hard not to feed some of them. But as a whole, if your goal is feed efficiency, we're going to limit byproducts, and we're just going to use them for a balancer when our forage plan or forage system didn't quite work. So my fiber metrics in the innovation diet is I'm looking for lactating diets to be in that 30% plus NDF. I would like higher NDF diets, but we're going to keep that UNDF, the undigestible fiber pool, really small. NDF limits intakes, but UNDF limits performance. And so our undigestible fiber on a 240 hour has a pretty fixed number where you can be. You can't really cheat that. You drop below 6% on a total diet, you're going to have animal manure consistency issues. You're going to have some animal health issues. They're going to look empty. You just can't get room and fill. You get over 8%, you're going to start losing some top end milk production. You know, cows are going to stick in that 80, 90 pounds and be okay, but you're not going to get the 130, 140 pound peaks on those on those diets. And then digestible fiber, we talked about the DNDF 30 number. That's fast pool digestible fiber. I want that to be in that 14 to 16% of my total diet. And just like I said, that number is important because we can get there. Almost any diet you look at, if you take the starch, the sugar, the digestible fiber, um, it's going to be in that 45% range on high producing cows. And it's just a matter of how do you get there? Do you want to get there through more starch, more sugar? Uh, like, how are you going to get there? And I would prefer to do it through digestible fiber versus starch. Okay, just talk just very slightly about corn, but so the corn hybrids that I'm looking for that I think work best in this system are medium height multi-purpose hybrids with a flowery grain profile, and I'll talk just briefly about the flowery aspect of that. So we were talking about rate of passage on fiber, and starch also is controlled by rate of passage. So um, this is work that was done at Michigan State, but the rate of passage on a floury corn versus just your normal um, grain corn is only about half as fast. And so the standard that the industry has used when it looks at starch digestibility is a 7 hour time point. That's putting starch in a rumen fluid for 7 hours. But if your grain is leaving the rumen at if your grain is leaving the rumen at 20% an hour, like how much of it is left after 7 hours? Like, you know the answer, right? So that 7 hour number might be an average, but it's also could be almost useless. Conversely, if it's leaving at 10 or 11% an hour, well, that 7 hour number um, is actually really conservative because it stayed in there longer. And I've done this with making fake rumens, just with TMR in a gallon jar with some ground up corn, and you shake it up, and a floury corn, it turns the water like milky colored. And it's like glue. It sticks to the forage particles and it stays in suspension. Where a normal hard or flinty corn settles out to the bottom and that water becomes clear a lot longer. And so when we start looking at a floury versus a flinty on a 7 hour starch availability number, they might only be 5 or 10% different. And you're like, okay, well, 5%, that's nice, but it's not, you know, groundbreaking. But if the one stays in there 10 hours and the one stays in there 5, all of a sudden we're looking at 15, 18, 20% difference on potential utilized starch. That's a huge number. And I thought I had a slide that I must have been in a different presentation. But if you start thinking about a 30% starch diet and that difference, if you have even a 70% starch availability in a 30% starch diet, and you're feeding 60 pounds of dry matter on a cow a day, that means that you fed 7 pounds of shell corn just to make up for the starch that wasn't digested in the rumen. And I'm not saying you can ever capture all of that, but can you capture 2 pounds of it, 3 pounds of it? Like that, that's real. And so one of the things that, my farms have really utilized is working with forage specific corn silage varieties with a floury starch profile. Okay. So back to our forage quality. Like, okay, so we talked more general what I want my ration to look like, but what is the forage quality that we're looking for? What do we have? About 10 or 15 minutes here yet? Or how?
About 9 minutes.
9 minutes. Okay, I'm gonna go through this fast. Um, I want forages that would be like 50 to 55% NDF. These are the non-corn silage forages that are going to the diet. That allows us to expand our fiber pool, but I want digestibilities to be in the 60, 70% range. Like they gotta be good. If you're gonna feed that, I mean, we can find ditch hay that's allows us to expand a fiber pool, but the digestibility of isn't good enough. So we need those two things to go in side by side. And then we want to keep that target, that UNDF pool, really low. These are some forages that can help us get there. I'm not saying all of them work in every situation, and they certainly don't agronomically work for every farm, but they're forages that, in the right situation, the nutrition side of it will fit. We've already talked earlier today about BMR sorghum Sudan, about forage sorghum, millet, Sudan grass, really all warm seasons. If you want to hit those metrics, you're going to need a brown midrib variety. You can't do it with a non-brown midrib. Cereal rye can work. It has a really narrow harvest window in the spring, but it can work. Triticale has an excellent forage quality and a wider harvest window, more yield upside, maybe a little more finicky. Fall forage oats, we're actively starting to plant those out here now in the fall. And those are amazing forage quality. Italian ryegrass, annual ryegrass out here. Most of those are going to get planted in the fall and harvested in the spring, but there may be some opportunities as parts of cocktail mixes as well. And then some of the legumes, certainly as part of annual cocktail mixes, they can fit a bill. And then cool season annual perennial grasses like orchard grass, tall fescue, festilolia, meadow fescue. All those have the potential to have excellent dairy quality fiber producers. That's some photoperiod sensitive BMR sorghum Sudan, a single cut system. Okay, and so how do we grow more of this? And in my farms, we're looking at more intensive crop rotation. So I already talked about alfalfa and why we're moving away from it from a feed quality standpoint, but also from an agronomic standpoint. The challenge is it ties up acres. Like everybody knows that first year corn is our easiest crop to grow, generally the most profitable crop we grow. But the problem is if we have a significant amount of perennial in our rotations, that also probably means we're growing a lot of corn on corn as well. If we eliminate that perennial and replace it with annuals, an annual cover crop mix, we're able to move all the corn in our farm into a perennial, into a first year corn situation. So the client I was just at this morning, they have ran over 3 tons, almost 3.5 tons of dairy quality small grain crop that they harvested in May this spring. Uh, and we followed that with a cocktail mix of BMR sorghum sudan, Italian ryegrass, and some clovers. We're going to run about 9 tons dry matter. I'm pretty good. We're going to hit right around 9 tons this year dry matter on that farm, on those acres, and that's going to utilize piles of manure, probably 20 to 30,000 gallons of manure through the growing season. It makes our nutrient management plan work, and it's actually going to out yield our corn silage acres on that farm. They're probably going to be somewhere in that 7 to 8 ton dry matter on their corn this year. But in this scenario, that red line is the slide that I just showed you before, where you have a declining corn silage yields over a 4-year period. You have a new seeding alfalfa. You have a couple good years of alfalfa, and then it starts sliding down. And then in year 9, you're back to first year corn. But if you eliminate the perennial and you move just to an annual rotation, by the 3rd year, you're above the line. Like, you're back on first year corn. And look at that year 5. Instead of having a new seeding alfalfa that can be really hit and miss on yields, we're up there at first year corn again. And what happens is, over an 8-year rotation, we're able to significantly increase the dry matter tons that we're harvesting per acre. We're able to accomplish soil quality goals. We're able to maybe go no-till easier. We're able to break insect cycles every other year. Um, all the things that we're facing when it comes to environmental challenges, nutrient management challenges, digestible fiber uh, challenges, we're able to fix with these kind of intensive crop rotations. And there is my contact info, and I will open it up to questions.
Not sure what that's supposed to say. What straw, especially wheat straw, can be used in dairy nutrition?
Yeah. Okay. So where does I'm not sure if I see that one, but I'll okay, so where does straw fit? So what straw does in a diet that is moving through a cow too rapidly, uh, it slows it down. And so straw itself is, on paper, is pretty awful feed. But because it slows down the rate of passage in a diet, all the other things that were going into that diet suddenly become more digested. It's not that they're more digestible. The actual TMR actually went down in digestibility when you added the straw, but it increased the extent. And that's what increased the digestibility and generally increased the performance. So as far as straw varieties or kinds, um, they really can all accomplish that same thing. Of course, wheat is probably the most common, but cereal rye can work, triticale can work as well, barley can work. I don't have a huge opinion on it, other than that they need to be clean, they need to be they can't have toxin loads or that kind of thing, um, and they can all work. But like I said, in my experience, or my preference would be that we build forage systems that don't actually need them, and we use them more as a band-aid and when things don't work right.
Got another one here. Please tell us how we increase fiber digestibility of forages practically on our farms.
So there's a the easiest ways. Well, the first thing is variety selection, the first thing is species selection. So we're moving to things that have higher levels of digestibility, and those would primarily be grasses versus legumes. And I'll put corn into that, but grasses.